Hi folks, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the short update video. I want to make an in-between videos video just to keep the flow going on the channel. As you can see, currently I'm working on my Mesh 50 and I want to show you in this video what I do every year prior to riding season. The wheels are off because I have new tires, and let's start with that. So it's exactly 7 years today that I own this bike. In the 7 years I've been riding it a lot. So much in fact that the rear tire was worn and I had the rear tire and front tire both replaced. Bought a bike in 2019 and back then those Chinese bikes had this little cliche of Chinese bikes to them. Build quality is good, but you have to set your expectations and keep up with maintenance in order to have a reliable bike. And I think I've been able to do that. But anyway, the tires were worn. The bike is currently at 29,000 kilometers, almost 29,000, and the rear tire was completely worn. I replaced the front tire too. It wasn't nearly worn, but the quality of that rubber material is such that the front tire started forming cracks along the circumference of the rim, so that wasn't all too nice, and the rubber compound was pretty abysmal, and I started noticing it after I restarted the Honda last year. When I have the Honda and go through a corner, it feels solid, it feels confident, and the mesh always feels like it wants to slide, especially when the roads are a little bit wet or there is a lot of moisture in the air. So I decided to replace both. I currently have Michelin tires on there. They were the most expensive that I could find, with almost 70 euros each, but I had my hopes up for these tires, so I'm gonna install that. While I had a rear tire out, I found a little design / fabrication fault that I want to show you. So what I usually do, I take the rear wheel out at the start of riding season, check the brakes, and I clean the chain and lubricate it. And this year I noticed that when I took the rear drum brake out, on the inside here, on the pivot point where the brake shoes pivot, you have this little washer and there's a split plane on there, but that split plane was broken. It was the residue I found inside the brake and the brake drum, and also the washer fell out. That's something that you want to prevent. I think if it's missing, it doesn't hurt because it only pivots at this point. The brake shoes won't go wandering, but you can never be sure. So what I did, I added an additional larger washer than the original washer and a fresh new split pin in there. There's something worth checking out. What I also do is clean this pivot point where the brake lever operates the brake shoes themselves. I clean it, I lubricate it, then I give the brake shoes themselves, the friction material, a little spritz with brake clean, and once over with Scotch-Brite. And I will do the same with the drum brake or the brake drum and the rear wheel itself. But this is something worth checking on these older Mesh 50 bikes. Here is the parts washer. I replaced the chain. All the things that I replaced I talked about in a little video. I'll leave the link up here in the corner. And that includes all the maintenance and wear things that I encountered during my ownership of the Mesh. Anyway, I take the chain off and the sprockets and such, clean them in my parts washer, and now it's been drying. Always give them a little spritz with brake clean, and it's been drying for almost a week now, so this is ready to go back on. But this is something that I do at the start of every riding season, and if necessary I repeat it, well, halfway summer, around every, say, 4,000, 5,000 kilometers. Another thing that's worth checking yearly are the bearings. These bearings from factory aren't that good. I replaced them at around 20,000 kilometers. They are so-called 2RS bearings, means that they are lubricated for life and sealed on both sides. And even though it says on the seal itself it's 2RS, those original bearings from those earlier Mesh bikes only have a seal on the inside. And as you can see, this is quite rusty. During washing, water can easily make its way into the rear wheel and into this. And my old bearings were completely rusted out. That's something that you don't hear while riding when you're maneuvering the bike with the engine off. You can hear it, but this is something worth checking. But I put some SKF or NTN bearings in there. They are real good bearings. That's something that's always worth checking every season. And I also did the same. Here is the front wheel. I replaced both front wheel bearings also. Of course, at the start of riding season, you always want to check the oil level, and they have this real nice side glass. This is something that I appreciate very much about this type of engine. Usually I do my oil changes at the start of riding season, and I write down the oil changes on the inside of this cover here, so I have a reminder. And currently did last oil change at 27,000 kilometers. Well, we're not 2,500 kilometers in, so I'll leave it be. Tip from my side, always warm up the engine or drive a little bit to get a little bit of temperature in there. I have this handy oil temperature gauge that I bought off of internet, and it needs to be at least 40 degrees Celsius, and then let the bike sit for 10 minutes, and then you can drain the oil. I did a separate video on the oil filtration system. After the break-in period, you need to remove the mesh that sits below the oil pump. There's a centrifugal filter in there that lasts the entire life of the bike. So after the initial break-in period, you actually do not need to take this cover off to clean the oil filters. Just change the oil every 2,500 kilometers. And there is the link to that video on the oil filtration system. So we made a little bit of progress. Rear wheel is in. What you have to look out for when you put rear wheel in, there are two spaces, one on either side of the rear wheel, and as you can see, the longest spacer is on the brake side and the shorter spacer is on the sprocket side. And it's, by the way, pretty easy to recognize because this little seal rubs a little mark into the spacer, so that's a reminder of which one goes where. To the point where I have to put my chain on, but before I do that, I want to point out this area here. Standard, these bikes, these engines come with a 13-tooth sprocket in front. I've changed it to a larger one. I believe I have 15. The thing you want to check is this cable here. That's from the generator over there, and there is this little holder, this little tab that holds it in place. But always check if you go to a larger size, or when you take this little cover off, that it hasn't been rubbing into those wires. Otherwise you'll come to a standstill while riding and you have nowhere to go unless you have a new cable loop. So there's that. Next thing is I'm going to put the chain on, and then I'm going to explain how you could tension or should tension your chain. So that's the chain on, it's ready for tensioning. Two things I want to point out. It is indeed a 15-tooth front sprocket. And as you can see, this car, just this bolt hole for the starter motor, that's where the chain barely touches. There's 1.5 millimeters of clearance, so you cannot go any larger than a 15-tooth sprocket on these little Lifan engines. Another thing, the chain is connected via this link, and this is what we call a fish in Dutch. Not sure how well it shows on camera, but fish swim forward. That means that the closed section of this little tab should face forward in the rotational direction, and the open end should face rearwards. So that's the head and the tail, and the fish should swim forward. Now on to tensioning. I cannot do this on camera. I'm filming this with my phone today, and I don't have a stand. Those sprockets are never perfectly circular, or at least the center isn't exactly in the center, so they always tend to wobble a tiny little bit. And since these have very different ratios, 15 in front, 52 in the back, every now and then the front sprocket faces a little bit more forward, and at the exact same time the rear sprocket faces a little bit more backward. And that's when the chain is under its highest tension. Now I have the chain installed. It's still not lubricated, so I don't get super greasy hands. But what I do, I feel till I find that point. Now it's not there yet, but I rotate a couple of times, and when I find the point with the most tension, that's when I start tensioning the chain, and I use about this much play. As it currently stands, it can go, well, a centimeter, maybe 2 centimeters up and down. You can have quite a bit of slop. What's important is that it doesn't slap into that little rubber guide over there. And if you're able to watch your chain while riding, it should be dancing up and down a little bit, and there should not be any real tight spots. And what often happens, if you found that point, found the perfect tension, and then you tighten the knot on the other side there, that will add a little bit extra tension. So always go check. Your chain can better be a little bit too loose than too tight, and it takes most of the times when I do this about 10 minutes to find the right spot, but it's always worth doing. Also, when your chain is too loose, you can really feel it during downshifts. You really get a smack in the drivetrain, and that's not good for anything over here, especially chain slapping in front. So you can see where it could hit the starter motor, and if it slaps and it locks up, you'll have some real bad luck, because if that shaft over here, these can bend. If the chain breaks and it locks up over here, it will bend that, and you can throw away the entire engine because it will break the crankcases. So that's another reason why it's important to keep an eye on your chain tension and lubricate it well so it doesn't break. A lot of these chains just break from lack of lubrication. I'm gonna tighten it, show you what the situation is, how it should be, so we have a little bit of a reference, and then we're gonna lube the chain. And of course we need a front wheel. Nice new tire, they look pretty nifty, although I saw they damaged the rim a little bit here and there, so I have to go over with a little bit of matte black paint. Anyway, before I put it in, I have to put the brake disc on. And one thing that you need to look out for if you're going to replace or remove the brake disc is this area over here. This face should be perfectly flat, so I went over with a little bit of Scotch-Brite, let me get it, and go over this entire surfaces, all these flat areas, to make sure it's entirely flat. You have to do the same on the brake disc. If it's not perfectly flat on, it will wobble, and you can feel it when you squeeze the brake. You can feel it vibrate. You always also run that risk when you have had the brake caliper off. Oh, let me film it from this way, and if you didn't assemble it correctly and it doesn't slide over these slide pins, you can put it in, but if you start braking, it doesn't move and it bends the brake disc, and that will immediately warp this brake disc. They are not very resistant to warping, so be careful. If you have disassembled the caliper, try to squeeze the brake lever very gently, and it should move quite freely, quite normally. If it doesn't, the cylinder in here can push onto the brake disc. I had it happen and it was warped. So this is my third brake rotor in a couple of years. Anyway, I've cleaned this area now and I'm gonna put it on. Another thing came to mind, I mounted it on. If you're going to tighten these bolts, just tighten them loosely so they rest against the surface, and then start tightening them in a cross pattern like you do with wheels. That also prevents the brake disc to go on a little bit crooked. And finally, you have to get a hammer and drift out to tap over these lock tabs. You only have to do one side like I did. So now the front wheel is ready to go back in. Well, that's the front wheel in. If you're gonna put it in, make sure that you push back the little cylinder in the brake caliper, so you have the brake pads as wide apart as you can, and then slide the rotor, brake disc in first. Another thing that you have to keep an eye out for is this little pickup for the speedometer. Oh, let me flip it over. There are two little tabs that fall into slots in the rim itself, in the hub. Make sure that they are in nice, and maybe chosen camera says up there so you know how it goes. And one of the very first things that I do before I even tighten the knot is just spin the wheel and see what a speedometer does. Stop the wheel, you can see it fall back. It's important that it works. These speedometer cables are pretty hard to lubricate, but if you're in for a fiddly job and have an hour and a half extra on your free day, you can unscrew the speedometer cable and lubricate it with some fairly thick grease. And also this, if you have this off, this is the second one that I have off. These wear out quite quickly, around 18,000 kilometers, Mine was worn, so I had to replace it. It's always worth taking this apart, clean it, lubricate it, and then put it back together. They aren't expensive, but for the money they cost, you can ride, well, maybe 2 or 3 months. So there's that. Oh, and what's also helpful in order to start a bike is put a side stand in. There is this kill switch over here that when you have it off it won't start, so that may also have been my problem. Speaking of which, there is a large screw on here. You really want to check if it's tight. It just rotates just a little bit. It will cause the bike not to start, unless if you experience that for the first time, it can be a little bit hard to find. Anywho, let's give it another whirl. There we are. So the very last thing to do is put the chain guard on. I like to take this off, and it makes it so much easier to install the rear wheel and the chain, and also to check the tension on the chain. I have tightened the the nut of the rear axle. It didn't shift. I always check that. There are also little markers on here and a sort of a ruler on there, but these aren't really reliable. What you can do is use a measuring tape and roughly see if the wheel is centered, if it doesn't shift to the right or the left side. That is pretty impossible thanks to these thick washers we have over here. So anyway, on goes the chain guard. And finally, a little cover for the front sprocket needs to go on. That's on. Both bolts are tightened. One thing to check, that's it, that the chain doesn't rub into this little cover because of the large front sprocket I use. Anyway, that's the yearly start of the season maintenance that I do to my bike. This year I added 2 new tires. I'm really curious to see how big of a difference it is, because the original Timsun tires that were on there were pretty bad. That's usually the case, especially for bikes of that era, Chinese bikes I mean. But the quality of Chinese products has improved so drastically over the years. It's really impressive and overwhelming that I think that the tires that come with the new mesh bikes already are much better. Now then again, these are Michelin tires, and I'm really curious to see how they hold up. Probably will be one of those changes that you make and that you think, oh, I should have done years and years earlier. Anyway, that's it for this episode. I hope I didn't rush my work too much. I decided to film this while I was arriving here, so it was an on-the-go project. If you have any questions, just let me know down below in the comment section. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope to see you in the next one. Have a safe ride. Bye.